Hey, welcome to our third part of the Eightfold Path. So today we'll be talking about the meditative components of the Eightfold Path. In some ways, the culmination of much of what we've been talking about. You could see some of the other aspects as preparatory. However, as I've been emphasizing, all of these work together, right? And so what we find in the meditative components will reinforce the other two sections as well. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll discuss these each in turn. Okay, so as a reminder of where we're at, and I'll bring this slide up. So we have been looking at the Eightfold Path and have discussed the wisdom components, right view and right thought, and the virtue components, right speech, right action, and right livelihood. So the first five. And so we're now going to shift into the last three, which are usually discussed together: right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So to begin with right effort or diligence, I think one thing to keep in mind or to consider is the connection we might draw between right effort, diligence, and right thought. Remember, right thought or right intention had a lot to do with how it is that we engage with the path. In particular, how it is we engage with the virtues on the path. And so, although there's a concern with things like desire in Buddhism, there is this notion of effort that's required, right? And so we find that here in both number 2 and in number 6. So the Buddha was concerned in a lot of ways with what effort was, right? How it is that we engage in a spiritual path, right? Because there's different ways that you could engage in a spiritual path. And one way you can engage in a spiritual path is through significant amount of effort. And those, like the Stoics, have sometimes been characterized as being a spiritual path of effort, right? That we constantly fight against our passions. It's like a battle that is always being waged and requires constant effort on our part to do that. Another way of engaging with a spiritual path would be no effort, right? To kind of let things be. And there's aspects of Buddhism that fall into this category, right? I mean, the idea that what is causing our suffering is this grasping, and that we need to let go, right? That indicates this idea that effort is actually what's causing the suffering, and so letting go of that effort is what's important. The Buddha wanted to try to find a way between these two different, what he says are extremes, right? That the spiritual path does in fact require some effort, right? But if it's too much effort, as he was engaging in when he was an ascetic, right? That time when he had more or less quit eating and was engaged in all of those sort of physical or bodily denying activities. Like, there was a lot of effort that was going into that practice, right? And so he was concerned with this idea of too much effort, right? That was actually a barrier to the spiritual path, right? And so there needs to be a loosening of that. But also, right, there needs to be some motivation, right, to engage in the path itself, right, to go through, to perform the various methods that are required in meditation, to engage with the virtues, to work towards a fuller understanding, right? All those things require some effort, right? And so what kind of effort is that? And famously, the Buddha uses this idea of tuning an instrument, right? That if you have a stringed instrument, if you tune it too tight, the string can snap. If you don't tune it tight enough, it'll be slack and you won't be able to hear anything, won't play any music. And so a properly tuned instrument requires something in between. And so the effort that's required, according to the Buddha, is this in between, this middle way, right? So, not denying basic needs of the body, but not sort of overindulging, right? But something in between is necessary. The same is true of the spiritual path itself, right? That overdoing it, right, can actually get in the way of spiritual progress. And there are a lot of different stories about how various practitioners have done that, and it wasn't until they began to let go of some of that they were able to progress. And so we get this something in between these two extremes of too much effort or sort of overdoing it and not enough. And so this middle way, of course, can be applied then to this idea of indulgence, but it also can be applied to the type of effort that is important in engaging in the spiritual path. So he defines here the Buddha in the Pali Canon, the Pali scriptures, right effort or diligence. It says there is the case where a monk generates desire, endeavors, activates persistence, upholds and exerts his intent for the sake of non-arising of evil, unskillful qualities that have not yet arisen. Right? And so we can think of this as a proper application of effort, right? Because this is the prevention of those unwholesome seeds from growing. Like those poisons that we've been talking about. It's a way of working to not allow those to grow. And sometimes it requires essentially a weeding out process. He generates desire, endeavors, activates persistence, upholds and exerts his intent for the sake of the abandonment of evil, unskillful qualities that have arisen. So returning those unwholesome seeds that have come up to the store consciousnesses, as we hear in the Mahayana tradition, right? So returning those to where they came from. He generates desire, endeavor, activates persistence, upholds and exerts his intent for the sake of the arising of skillful qualities that have not yet arisen, right? And so we need to do something to encourage those wholesome qualities, right? So we need to develop habits, right? This is the work of developing habits. And then finally, generates desire, endeavors, activates, persists, and upholds, exerts his intent for the maintenance, non-confusion, increased plenitude, development, and culmination of skillful qualities that have arisen. This, monks, is called right effort. And so we need to continue to practice the wholesome activities, right? That we can't let go of our work that has already been done, but we need to continue to engage in wholesome in those wholesome activities, right? And so different types of effort obviously are required for each of these. So the prevention of wholesome seeds, right? That's one thing. Maybe requires a bit of letting go there, right? Don't grasp onto things that are harmful. A returning of the unwholesome seeds, undoing old habits, right? We know that that's difficult, and so that requires a certain type of effort. Developing new habits, right? We know the kind of effort that's required for that, to engage in a practice or an activity until it becomes habitual, and then continuing to develop the seeds that are already arisen. And we know that the work towards that is actually much less, right? Once we've developed a habit, it becomes much less, and so the effort can mellow out a bit when those wholesome seeds have already arisen, but there still needs to be some effort. And so the effort required at the beginning of the path, perhaps, is significant compared to the effort that's required later on. But there needs to be an ongoing tautness, right? Attention to continue those wholesome seeds, to keep them watered. So this right effort, right, is important, and it's essential for both beginning but also continuing the path. Okay, so that's effort. So what about mindfulness? Kind of the core of the meditative portion of the Eightfold Path, and we'll see when we get to right concentration, like it perhaps should come. One might argue come before right mindfulness. I'm not the Buddha. I let the Buddha have it in the order that the Buddha developed it, but there's a sense in which the training that goes on in concentration is actually what's necessary for this right mindfulness. However, we'll talk about them in turn, in the order that the Buddha presented them. So mindfulness is a term that we are aware of, that's used quite a bit today. It's used outside of the context of Buddhism, but we need to recognize that what we call mindfulness today, right, has as its source Buddhist practice, right? And so it goes back to this sutta, this scripture. The word sutta just means essentially a scripture, a writing. It's a discourse. So in the Satipatthana Sutta, Maha Satipatthana Sutta, which is the work, the Buddhist work on mindfulness in the Theravada tradition, mindfulness is talked about in a very practical way, right? So when the question of what is mindfulness arises, right mindfulness, what is it? The Buddha talks about how it is that we engage in it, and gives various exercises that you can engage in. So an example of that has to do with what we often think of in terms of mindfulness meditation, and that's breath. Using the breath as an anchor in our meditation, seeing the breath, watching it in terms of its length, its depth, and just being aware of the breath, right? Sitting down, and the lotus position, closing or fixing the eyes, and just following the breath in and out, in and out. Right. The instructions for that are found in the Maha Satipatthana Sutta, and so we can find that core mindfulness practice in the ancient Buddhist scriptures. So here, the Buddha is defining what is right mindfulness. He says that there's the case where a monk remains focused on the body in and of itself, ardent, alert, and mindful, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. He remains focused on feelings in and of themselves, right? These are different things that you can do, right? So you can focus on the body in and of itself, or you can focus on feelings in and of themselves. The mind in and of itself, right? You focus on the mind in and of itself. You can focus on the mental qualities in and of themselves, right? And there's this putting aside, right? So there's the two components here. One is this focus on whatever it is, so the breath that we just mentioned, or the body, or feelings of the body, or so on, right? And then there's the putting aside of greed and distress. And so, the common instruction here is that these things, greed and distress, arise, right, when we try to meditate, for example. The ideas come up, feelings come up, all this stuff sort of comes up. And so the putting aside is just a letting go of that, letting that pass through without becoming attached in any way to it, right? And so it becomes a training and moving from what we're sort of just following because our mind throws it at us, back towards whatever it is that we're focusing on, whether it be the body, the feelings, the mind, the breath, the mental qualities, whatever it is, right? And so there's those two parts. There's the focus, and then there's the returning when we become distracted. And any meditator will tell you that distractions are common, right? That's not something that is alien to meditation. That all people, when they sit down to meditate, have thoughts, and it's learning how to approach those thoughts in the right sort of way with the right kind of effort, right? Not a shoving away, right, but a letting them pass through, perhaps labeling them, saying, that this is a thought, or this is a feeling, or this is sadness, or whatever, right, and letting it pass through. So that's the definition of mindfulness, or how mindfulness works within the Mahasatipatthana Sutta. Now, Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a book actually called The Miracle of Mindfulness, and is very interested in what mindfulness can do, right? That it's a practice that one can engage in, both in a formal practice of seated meditation, for example, as well as an more informal practice in our everyday lives. And so he spends a lot of time talking about different ways that mindfulness can be helpful, as well as giving instruction on how to engage in mindfulness. So these are what he calls the miracles, right? What are the fruits of mindfulness? What can we gain from mindfulness? So the first is present and touch deeply the object of perception. Right. So when we engage in some sort of mindful practice, what do? We become present and we touch deeply, right? We become fully aware. We have our full attention on whatever the object of our perception is. Right. So, it could be this pen, right? So become present and touch fully, deeply the object of our perception. We make the other present, right? So that becomes what is present to us. We nourish, right? We nourish the object of our attention, right? We give it our energy. We relieve the other suffering, and so he talks here about engaging in this miracle of mindfulness in terms of other people, right? And so relieving their suffering, right? Seeing their suffering, their dukkha, their attachments, and so on, right? Looking deeply, right? So that can be looking deeply within ourselves, or in the other, the object of the focus. But there's this looking deeply. This is related to a term called vipassana, or insight, and it's often talked about as a type of meditation, but it's something that arises in mindfulness meditation as well. But it's an understanding. So when he says here, looking deeply, it's understanding. So this pen, understanding its source, that it's made of plastic, that where that plastic came from, that it was, manufactured, that it's been used to write various things, that it's, all sorts of things can come from deeply understanding the pen. And of course, even more can come when we look deeply, if the object is another living being. But vipassana is also central to Buddhism because it's how we begin to make sense of ourselves and the world, right? How we begin to understand things like impermanence. It's how we begin to understand where our suffering comes from. So, for example, when I talked about when you do kind of basic mindfulness meditation, following the breath, and you become distracted over and over again, right? Well, what happens there is you become aware of those distractions, that you are distracted, that you have this tendency to become hooked on one thing or another, right? And so there's an element in, you know, what we would see as like the failure parts of meditation, right? That they provide us with insights, right? They give us a clue into ourselves and into our struggles. And so we find vipassana insight in mindfulness meditation as well. We develop a deeper understanding, right? So as I said, that uh, in meditation, we actually are working on right view, right? Because we are understanding the world and ourselves better. And so part of the goal of meditation, of mindfulness, is that understanding, right? Is being able to know or to understand things in a more deep way. But the point of that, why do we want to understand that? The point of that is so we can let go of those desires, that we can, you know, let go of our grasping. We can cultivate loving kindness and wisdom, right? And so to do, you know, the reason we do that is for this final point of just transformation, right? To be able to engage in the world in a new and fresh way, where we're present at all times, non-judgmental, and so on, right? And that's a transformation. And that transformation goes back to right effort, right? That practice of where we habituate ourselves over time transforms us into new beings, into a new self. So those are the miracles of mindfulness, according to Thich Nhat Hanh. There's, in some ways, you can see them as a step-by-step approach to mindfulness. If you're engaging in mindfulness kind of in an everyday way, where you're dealing with objects and people and so on. So I already mentioned this, that mindfulness leads to insights. So when we engage in mindfulness, right, what do? We begin to see the world, see ourselves, see our own behavior, our own patterns of behavior, and so that's insight, right? And so it's a part of the mindfulness meditation path, not necessarily a separate form of meditation. It is separate, although I think we also find a lot of understanding when we engage in concentrative practices, but it's distinct from concentration, samatha, which is the number 8 of the Eightfold Path. So, and what do we learn, right? When we engage in mindfulness meditation, we learn interdependence, right? That all things are interrelated, that this pen, as I sort of use as an example, is made up of, as Thich Nhat Hanh would point out, that it's made up of non-pen elements, right? It's made of plastic and the metal, and it's formed in a certain way. It was made by humans and human machines, right? All those things are integral to this pen, right? And so it's made up of all non-pen elements. It's interdependent with everything else. Impermanence, right? That it is not something that will be around forever. And there was a point where it wasn't, right? It was created and it will go out of existence. And finally, compassion, right? And this comes with the understanding, right, that we gain from mindfulness meditation, that we see the sources of people's, hurt and can be compassionate, say, hey, I felt that same thing too. Like, maybe I'm expressing it in a different way than you did, but I also know the feelings that you're feeling, and so on. So, um, so insight is a fruit, a product of mindfulness meditation. In addition, and we'll talk about this more, but in addition, we begin to see things as they are, right? That all things come and go, come, sort of in existence, out of existence, but nothing really seems to disappear, totally go away. Right here, we begin to see the conditioned realm, which are the objects of the world, right? But the unconditioned realm, right? That there's an ultimate reality. That all these things are interconnected. And so the metaphor that Thich Nhat Hanh uses is the wave versus the ocean, right? That we see the waves and so on, right? But they're made of ocean, and no matter how short-lived that wave is, it's still going to return to the ocean. And as it's living, right, it's made completely of ocean parts. Each thing in that way contains everything else, because everything in the universe is conditioned by everything in the universe. Things are the way they are because of the way everything else is, right? And so everything contains all other things. So of course, what do we get with this, right? We begin to develop knowledge and understanding. We begin to develop that right view more fully. We know the way the world is and ourselves. And so, for sort of the people, the philosophers in the room, right? Meditation can be seen as a form of epistemology, a form of knowledge gathering, and a way of obtaining knowledge. And it's an experiential thing, right? So even if it's not something that can be explained very easily, it's something that is experienced. And so there's this radical empirical element, right, where true knowledge is understood only through our experience of it. Like, somebody can't teach us this stuff and us have true knowledge of it. It's only in the experience itself that we gain the knowledge. As I point out there at the bottom, right, this knowledge, however, has the purpose of transformation. This is the same as the Hellenistic philosophers, right? That the purpose of philosophy, of metaphysics, of understanding reality, was not for its own purpose, but to help us in our own transformation. So here too, meditation, the purpose is this, perhaps is this knowledge, but that knowledge aids us in our own transformation. That's the reason that we engage in it. I mentioned this last time, and I'm going to mention it again here, but the precepts are still part of this meditative reality, right? Perhaps some practitioners and teachers will emphasize meditation over and above the moral precepts, but that means that we take something essential out, according to someone like Thich Nhat Hanh. So Thich Nhat Hanh would say that the purpose of all of this is to live a life, and to live a certain type of life. And so trying to say, like, we're not going to worry about the precepts is like saying we're not going to worry about what's core to meditation in the first place. So the precepts don't disappear and are not distinct here. So that's right mindfulness. So I'm going to spend just a minute on right concentration. And concentration is a little bit different. There are definitely concentrative elements in forms of mindfulness meditation, because we're using the breath as an anchor. But in mindfulness meditation, the breath is not a focal point in the same sort of way. right? It's a mechanism for us to return to ourselves when we become distracted. In right concentration, we elicit effort, right, to engage in our attention on a particular object, right? So it's a kind of heightened effort. And what does this do? Is this trains the mind, right? It is like a practice which aids the mind in becoming more single focused, right? And so our attention becomes much more clear, more narrow. And so it's got a strong motivation behind it, right? It's very helpful to engage in right concentration. But in some ways, right, the development of right concentration is an aid to right mindfulness. It's the other form of meditation that we have just finished discussing. One thing about concentration is we begin to see results, right? Actual results from it, and we saw that in the video on the Buddha, where the Buddha engaged in this sort of mindfulness, or excuse me, this concentrative exercise of following the plow, and it was through following the plow that he began to his mind began to soften, right, or to let go of the concerns that the young Buddha had, right, and so we see these different what are called jhanas, stages in the development of concentration, and so the first is this withdrawal of the senses and unskilled activity. And so this is very pleasurable, right? This feels good to do this. Maybe you're kind of aware of this if you are engaged in any sort of skill or activity where it requires your full focus, right? And you're single pointed on one thing, and you get a benefit from it, right? The next is the stilling of thought and judgment and unified awareness unhindered by thoughts, right? And so that focus becomes even more laser, right? And the judging mind begins to fall away. It no longer is helpful or important and begins to fall away. Third, rapture disappears, right? So the pleasurable feelings around the concentration, right, begins to disappear, and we begin to see things in equanimity, and we get this mindfulness as well. Right? So this isn't distinct in that way, but it's just a different path towards it. So it's by that concentration that everything else begins to fall away, and so here, through sort of ongoing practice, we're able to then see things in the world in this equanimous way, right? That see things in equality, without being drawn and yanked by one thing or another, as well as not the desire, right, just for the good feelings of doing a practice. So this is experienced as pleasure without rapture. And then finally, abandonment of pleasure and stress, right? So where those no longer are helpful or important. And in this, we get to the point of an awareness, like this kind of broad, unhindered awareness, right awareness. Because we're no longer chasing what we want and running away from what we don't want. And so there's a clarity and an expansiveness that arises from that. Okay. So those are the four jhanas, and we see how right concentration can be a helpful aid in our practice, and so taking these together, right, we have two different angles on essentially the same sort of thing. which is insight, is to understand the self, right? Understand the suffering that arises, where it arises from, and how to alleviate that suffering. So coming back then to our wheel, as we've completed the entire trip, right view, right thoughts, coming under wisdom, right speech, right action, right livelihood, coming under virtue, and then finally right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, coming under meditation or contemplation. And then each of these, again, reinforces the other, and they're all part of an ongoing wheel, an ongoing path. So one isn't complete at any point. So that is it on the Eightfold Path, the two core teachings, the form of a truth, the Eightfold Path, gives a grounding in Buddhism. We're going to look at a few more important doctrines in Buddhism next few discussions before moving to a discussion of different forms of Buddhism. So stay tuned for that. Thanks again for listening.